High End GTX versus Low End RTX. Which one would win in 2023? To find out, I've put the 1080 Ti up against the RTX 2060 Super in a head-to-head benchmarking test to find out which one is the better GPU in 2023. So are you Team GTX with the 1080 Ti or Team RTX with the 2060 Super? Let me know in the comments down below. Not bad. Looking at the pair of these GPUs, and the specs couldn't be further apart. The 1080 Ti has 3,584 CUDA cores, 11GB of GDDR5X which runs through a 352-bit memory bus. All of this is in a package rated for 250 watts, and Nvidia recommends at least a 600 watt power supply to power this thing. I have the Acer Strix Gaming OC model, which is one of the better 1080 Ti's, and it's got a 3-fan cooling design, RGB all over the place, and a custom PCB. On the other hand is the RTX 2060 Super. It's newer and it's got a lot less CUDA cores at 2,176. It's only got 8GB of GDDR6 memory, which could hurt its performance in newer, more VRAM intensive titles. In all fairness, the VRAM on the 2060 Super is faster, even though it has 3 less gigabytes of it, so that is sort of a pro and a con at the same time. But all of this is in a package rated for 175 watts, and Nvidia recommend a 450 watt power supply to power the 2060 Super. To be honest, I'd recommend something like a 550 just for a bit more headroom, but that's just me personally. As it's an RTX card, it has both RT and Tensor cores, and this allows for the RTX feature set, which includes real-time hardware accelerated ray tracing, and more importantly, deep learning super sampling, otherwise known as DLSS, which are both notably lacking on the older GTX card. Also, if you're a content creator or streamer, the 2060 Super might be a bit of a winner for you because it has the newer updated Turing NVENC encoder, and what this means is you will get better encoding quality with your gameplay, therefore your streams and gameplay will look better, so that's an automatic win for the 2060 Super right there. On paper, the 1080 Ti should be around 12% faster in terms of rasterization performance over the RTX 2060 Super. I do believe this to be the case in older games, but with some newer games having better driver improvements for the RTX card perhaps, maybe in some newer games the 2060 Super might have the upper hand, let alone the extra feature sets that it supports. Yet again, it's old versus new or newer in today's video. So will the older and more power hungry GTX 1080 Ti win with its raw GPU power, or will the efficiency and potential driver optimizations of the newer RTX 2060 Super gain it an upper hand? To find out, I'll put both of these on my test bench system, which has a Intel Core i5-12400F, 32GB of dual rank dual channel DDR4 memory running at 3200 MHz, an MSI B660-A Pro motherboard, and a Sabrent 1TB NVMe Gen 3 SSD. All testing today has been done at both 1080p and 1440p, and both graphics cards were running on driver version 537.34. The only adjustments that have been done to both of these graphics cards is the power slide has been maxed on both of them, so there's been no overclocking on either of these graphics cards. So let's see how they stack up against each other in 2023. So the first game up today is Starfield, and it is actually the newest game. The preset I went with here is the Hardware Unbox Optimized preset with FSR 2 at 80% render res. I feel like this is probably the best for at least 1440p, maybe not so much for 1080p. However, at 1080p, the 1080 Ti got 48 FPS on average, but the 2060 Super upped this by 27%, going to 61 FPS. Moving over to 1440p, and the story pretty much stays the same, with the 1080 Ti getting 38 FPS on average, but the RTX 2060 Super improves this by 24%, going up to 47 FPS. So if you want to play Starfield, the 2060 Super is a better option here, but I'd probably recommend AMD's RX 6600 because I suspect that will perform way better than both of these graphics cards. Fortnite is up next, and I use my typical graphics settings with DirectX 12 with low everything apart from the high view distance and high textures. At 1080p, the 1080 Ti fared quite well, getting 261 FPS on average, and the 2060 Super only went up by 1% to 264. I suspect both these graphics cards were CPU limited at 1080p. Switching up to 1440p, the 1080 Ti gets 198 FPS on average, whereas the 2060 Super gets 190 FPS. So that's a 4% performance uplift with the 1080 Ti, as that did perform better in this title. But then again, performance on both these graphics cards is totally fine in Fortnite. You're getting 198 FPS over 190, you're not going to notice the difference there. Next up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and the 1080 Ti has a pretty minor win here, to be honest. At 1080p it got 139 FPS compared to the 133 FPS of the RTX 2060 Super. And switching this up to 1440p, the 1080 Ti gets 103 FPS, whereas the RTX 2060 Super gets 96 FPS. That's a 7% performance uplift in favour of the 1080 Ti at 1440p. So if you want to play Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, both these graphics cards are perfectly viable, but the 1080 Ti does get better performance. Forza Horizon 5 is a game that shocked me. Here I set it to the high preset even though the game recommended Ultra, and I'm kind of glad I set it to the high preset because at 1080p the 1080 Ti got 92 FPS on average, but the 2060 Super ups this by 24% going to 114 FPS. The story pretty much stays the same at 1440p as the 1080 Ti got 79 FPS, but the 2060 Super got 93 FPS. That's a performance uplift of 18% switching to the RTX 2060 Super at 1440p, so I'm not sure what was going on in Forza Horizon 5. I did try to retest this game and the performance results were exactly the same, so I'm just going to put this down to driver and game improvements for the RTX card. Next game up is Horizon Zero Dawn, and the 2060 Super sees another win here, as at 1080p it got 13% more performance on average, getting 112 FPS on average compared to the GTX 1080 Ti's 99 FPS. Switching up to 1440p, the 1080 Ti only got 73 FPS on average, whereas the 2060 Super got 81 FPS on average. This is a performance uplift of 11%, so that is fairly minor, but it is a performance uplift nevertheless. Rainbow Six Siege was a pretty weird one here, because at 1080p the 1080 Ti trails the 2060 Super by 9%, getting 279 FPS on average, whereas the 2060 Super got 303 FPS. But switching up to 1440p sees the 2060 Super trail the 1080 Ti by 6%, as it got 194 FPS compared to the 1080 Ti's 206. Either way, at both resolutions, you're not going to notice that much of a difference between these, so I'd go with what GPU is cheaper at the time, or maybe the 2060 Super if you feel like you're going to stream. Cyberpunk sees an improvement with the RTX 2060 Super, and this isn't really that much of a surprise at 1080p. Here I set it to the medium preset with high textures, and the 2060 Super gets 8% more performance on average, getting 85 FPS on average compared to the 1080 Ti's 79. This isn't that big of a performance improvement, and to be fair, I was expecting a bigger performance gap between these two graphics cards. Switching up to 1440p, and both graphics cards scale roughly the same, to be honest, with the 2060 Super getting 55 FPS on average and the 1080 Ti getting 51 FPS on average. You're not really going to notice that much of a difference between these two graphics cards. But then again, at 1440p, you could always enable DLSS on the 2060 Super and you would get more frame rate there with minimal quality loss, as it is a better upscaling method compared to AMD's FSR, which is the only one available on the 1080 Ti. Last up today is F123, and this is actually quite a big shocker as well, because at 1080p, the 2060 Super gets 20% more performance on average, with 121 frames on average compared to the 1080 Ti's 101. So the 2060 Super here at 1080p is certainly a lot better than the 1080 Ti. Switching up to 1440p reduces the RTX 2060 Super's lead to just 13%, as it got 94 FPS on average, whereas the 1080 Ti got 83 FPS on average. So at 1440p and 1080p, the 2060 Super is the graphics card you should be buying if you want to play F1 23. At 1080p, the GTX 1080 Ti trails the 2060 Super by 9% on average across the 10 games tested today. Starfield, F1 23 and Forza Horizon 5 were the games where the 1080 Ti lagged behind quite a bit. This was pretty much an RTX 2060 Super stomping ground. To be fair, I was expecting the poor Starfield performance. However, F123 and Forza Horizon 5 were kind of disappointing and I wasn't expecting that. I restarted the PC and reran the tests, and that was the performance that the 1080 Ti could get. There's nothing more I could have done for it. And even Modern Warfare 2 actually did perform better consistently on the 1080 Ti as well, so that's a win for it there. Also, older games like The Witcher 3 and GTA 5 did perform better on the 1080 Ti. I didn't fully cover them in depth, but they were in the benchmarking suite today, and the 1080 Ti did get a win over the 2060 Super here, which is something that I was expecting. Because of this, I have to put the poor performance in newer games down to either driver optimizations or game optimizations. As in these games, the 1080 Ti was being fully utilised at around 95 to 99%, but it was only using around 180 watts, which is not the TDP of the 1080 Ti. It should use around 250 when it's maxed out, so I suspect that the GPU isn't properly being utilised in these titles. At 1440p, the performance delta between these cards reduces to just 4%. And here the 1080 Ti picks up some wins in Rainbow Six Siege and even Fortnite. Even though these are minor wins, the wins nevertheless, but at this resolution with these games, you can't go wrong with either card, to be honest. I suspect these little wins at 1440p for the 1080 Ti are down to memory bandwidth. Even though it's got slower GDDR5X memory, it's got a much wider memory bus at 354 bits, so that could be why the 1080 Ti is winning a bit more at 1440p. As it performed better overall, the 2060 Super has a better cost per frame at £1.12 and £1.56 at 1080p and 1440p respectively. Also, the fact that it's cheaper on average does help with this. On the other hand, the 1080 Ti's cost per frame is £1.32 and £1.74 at 1080p and 1440p respectively. Do remember though, that is in the games tested today, so it depends on which game that you're looking to play. If it's an older game, the 1080 Ti might have a slightly better cost per frame, but if it's a newer game, the odds are the 2060 Super is going to be having the win right here. So out of the pair of these GPUs, which is the one that I would recommend? And as always, there's a few caveats to this, so I'm going to break it down for you. If you want to play newer games, stream, or you want access to ray tracing features, the 2060 Super is obviously going to be the graphics card for you. It gets better performance in newer games, it will make your streams look better with the Turing NVENC encoder, and it also has RTX features like real-time hardware accelerated ray tracing and deep learning super sampling, otherwise known as DLSS. And it will also do this while using less power as well, so if power is your concern, the 2060 Super is also a very good bet. On the other side of the coin is the GTX 1080 Ti, and you might be thinking, what has this actually got going for it now? And the main thing is better performance in older games. Older games are less subject to driver improvements as they don't really get updated that much, like look at GTA 5. The story mode of that hasn't been updated since like 2015, it's been quite a while now. But in older games, the GTX 1080 Ti will perform better as it does actually have more GPU raw horsepower, but it isn't being utilised as well in newer titles. Also, if you want to play these older games at 4K, that is possible. I have tested that and that video is coming out very soon, so make sure you stay subscribed for that because it's quite interesting at how well this card will play older games at 4K. Also, the 1080 Ti does have an extra 3GB of video memory as well, which can help out at higher resolutions, even 1440p in newer games, as 8GB of VRAM is cutting it a bit close for ultra texture quality now, so that is something to think about. So it's sad to see the 1080 Ti get outpaced by GPUs like the RTX 2060 Super in newer games, especially back in 2018 as it was going toe-to-toe with the RTX 2080 when that launched, so it's kind of fallen from grace a bit as the maturity of the drivers for the RTX series and sort of the stagnation of the GTX series is kind of gone like that, if that makes sense to you. But it's not just the performance where the 2060 Super has a leg up on the 1080 Ti, it's also got newer features like DLSS and ray tracing and better NVENC encoding and just better driver support in general. This has to be a win for the 2060 Super because you essentially lose no graphical quality at 1440p when you enable DLSS on quality. So yeah, I use it all the time at 1440p with my RTX 3080, so Yeah, so the TLDR of today's video is, if you want to play newer games and you want newer features, the RTX 2060 Super is the GPU for you. If you want to play older games, perhaps running them at high resolutions like 4K, the GTX 1080 Ti is the graphics card for you. So you just make sure you buy the right graphics card out of these. So with that being said, I'm going to leave this one here. If you like this one, like it, stay subscribed for more tech content, and I'll catch you in the next one.